My father, Colonel Richard Vale, stood in front of my entire command at Iron Ridge and pointed a finger straight at my heart. He wasn't talking to me, he was sentencing me. Who let this disgrace in here? He thundered, and the world split. In two, he believed his rank could erase me, silence me, obliterate every mark I'd made in the dirt of my own career. What he didn't know was that the silence he wielded was only the blueprint for his own. Destruction. My name is Major Camille Vale. I'm 37 years old. The heavy steel door to the Strategic Operations Center, our war room, hissed shut. Behind me, trapping me inside with that silence. It wasn't an ordinary silence. It was suffocating, almost predatory. The air was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the industrial hum of the climate system and everything to do with the 50 pairs of eyes that turned toward me, sharp as a pack of wolves scenting blood. Not a greeting, not a single. Not of acknowledgement. Just those whispers snaking through the air like poison. That's her, Colonel Vale's daughter, the one who destroyed the Prometheus prototype. Each word a dart landing on their skin. My nerves prickled. My posture snapped rigid, chin up, eyes forward, instinct taking over. But under the starched uniform, I felt as exposed as an insect pinned to a collector's board. The polished floor reflected their faces, each one twisted with judgment or pity. Every step I took, the click of my regulation shoes was a solitary, sharp warning. I wasn't here for their pity. I was here to do what none of them, for all their whispers, could do. And then I saw him, my father, Colonel Richard Vale, standing beside the main holoscreen as crimson-era warnings pulsed, each flash another reminder of my supposed failure. He didn't look at me at first. He was performing, and his opening act was my humiliation. He let me stand there, soaking in their contempt for exactly 15 seconds, I counted. Each heartbeat was an eternity. Then, with slow, exaggerated care, he turned. His eyes the same cold gray as mine scanned me head to toe, not like a father, but like a commander inspecting a broken weapon. A thin, merciless smile stretched his lips. And then he laughed a sound with no warmth, only cruelty. It was a detonation, a calculated blast meant to strip me bare in front of every officer, engineer, and subordinate who had ever depended on me. His laughter ricocheted off the sterile walls. A public execution by sound. As the last echo faded, a suffocating silence fell. He let it linger before speaking, a low, grinding voice that hammered each word into my bones. Who let this failure in here? No name, no rank, just one word, failure. 15 years of service, every triumph, every sacrifice collapsed into that single burning label. He stabbed a finger at me, a final public execution. Beside him, Chief Engineer Ben Holloway, my father's golden protege, wore a smile that was all teeth. He was enjoying every second. I could feel the world collapsing, not from technical disaster or machine explosion, but from the shattering weight of my father's 4 words. The floor seemed to tilt under me. The faces blurred, watercolor streaks of disdain. My breath caught. A knot of grief and rage so tight I could barely stand. Just as darkness crowded my vision, the far doors slid open with a hiss. A woman entered. Small, spare, dressed in a severe charcoal suit, her hair silver and drawn back in a tight knot. She didn't hesitate. She moved with a gravity that pulled every gaze to her. Dr. Olivia Bennett, Pentagon's enforcer, walked straight to my father. No hesitation, no glancing around. She forced him to meet her eyes. Actually, Colonel, she said, voice as clear and cold as steel, I authorized the project's original designer to be present. Her gaze cut like a scalpel. Your incident is my problem now. And I do not tolerate circuses. For a moment, her words hung like a shield. I watched the color drain from my father's face, pride stripped to a chalky humiliation. The monolith cracked. And in that moment, I could finally breathe. His laughter still echoed in my mind, a sound I'd heard before. It took me back 15 years to the great stone halls of Norwich Academy. I was 17. My hair was longer then, pulled back in a simple ponytail, my face still untouched by the lines of disappointment. I was standing on a stage, spotlights glaring, the scent of old wood and lemon polish heavy in the air. I had just won first place at the National Military Engineering Expo for Defense Dependence, my project, a miniaturized inertial guidance system built over a year of sleepless nights, solder burns, and 100 failures before one elegant success. The thrill when they called my name was electric, a wild joy that made my hands shake as I accepted the award. I felt for the first time the real pride of creation of bending chaos to your will. Then my father, celebrated officer and guest of honor, was called to speak. In 2 minutes, he took my victory and twisted it. At the podium, his voice resonated through the auditorium, talking about teamwork, core values, and leadership, none of which he had ever shown me. And then, with a flourish, he pointed to my younger brother Eric, bored and half asleep in the 3rd row. "Camille's success," he announced, "is a testament to the inspirational leadership of my son Eric." The crowd erupted with applause for Eric for a lie. I stood holding a trophy, feeling utterly invisible. The physical weight was nothing compared to the hollow in my chest. He didn't just diminish my work, he erased me. After the ceremony, Eric clapped me on the back. "We did it, Cam." He didn't see the theft. He didn't feel the poison. My father had taught him entitlement was his due, that my work was always meant to lift him higher. The sharp pain of betrayal was worse for being so casual, so inevitable. That night, I sat alone in the guest barracks, the trophy gleaming dully in the lamp's glow. My uncle, my mother's brother, a quietly brilliant senior NASA engineer, arrived, haggard from a long drive, saying little. He only placed his hand over my blueprints, respecting the truth of what I'd made. "Stories can be changed, Cam," he rumbled. "But this machine obeys only the truth. And you are the one who built that truth." His words became a fortress in my heart. Not a cure, but a shield. My worth wasn't in applause or in my father's stories, it was in metal, logic, and silent understanding. That shield, built in silence, kept me whole, but it didn't pay the rent. When I left the military, I poured everything I had into an old metal garage on the edge of El Toro, Arizona. Bay 11, it was an empire of dust and sweat. Summers burned, winters bit. The place reeked of oil, burnt metal, and the bitter coffee I drank from a chipped mug. My new company, a battered set of tools and an ancient radio. I took any work water. Pumps for chili farms, decrepit trucks, failing generators. Honest labor, hard on the hands and soul, but it was mine. At first, every man who walked in doubted me. One old rancher, sunburned and sour, dropped his keys and growled, "You break." "It worse, I'm not paying." I just nodded and worked 12 hours straight, bloodied, grease-smeared, but when the engine roared to life, his contempt faded to respect. He paid in cash and left without a word. That was enough. Late one night, after fighting a busted transmission, I sat against a stack of tires, drinking cheap beer, scrolling emails. One subject line, good news. It was from Eric. He was celebrating his promotion, bragging about a logistics plan I recognized as my idea, one I'd shared on a napkin years before. He was winning, basking in comfort while I fought for every dollar. I deleted his email and drank. The old anger burned, but I didn't let it drown me. I stood, stiff and sore, and turned to my project, an ancient generator, long pronounced dead. I listened as my uncle had taught. I heard what others missed, traced a flaw to a hairline crack invisible to any tool. At dawn, the generator came. Alive, smooth, and perfect. My victory silent, unwitnessed, real. That was enough. But my quiet victories didn't stay quiet for long. Word spreads fast in the desert, especially when it's about something that shouldn't be possible. After a year in Bay 11, fixing the unfixable for every rancher and farmer from Yuma to the edge of the reservation, my reputation became its own currency. If Camille Vale can't fix it, nobody can. That's what people started saying. I clung to that, maybe too tightly, a badge pinned to my chest where the medals never landed. One crisp morning, just as I was wiping the grease from my hands, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender's address was a string of nonsense almost. Certainly encrypted. The message was short, cold, stripped of any pretense. "We have a technical problem. Your consultation is required. Discretion is absolute. A car will collect you tomorrow at 800. No name. No signature, nothing official." Every instinct from my years in uniform screamed caution. But the engineer in me, the part that was addicted to hard problems, felt that old hunger again. I replied with one word, confirmed. The next morning at precisely 8 o'clock, a matte black SUV rolled up in front of Bay 11, its windows dark and impenetrable. The driver, silent and unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses, nodded at me to get in, no questions. The road curled through endless sun-blasted plains, and then suddenly, we turned down a path lined with broken fence posts and dry tumbleweed. From the outside, it looked like a failed cattle ranch, but the glint of cameras in the eaves and the new tire tracks in the dirt said otherwise. The woman who greeted me was small, steely, and absolutely in command. Dr. Olivia Bennett, though. She never introduced herself that way, just Olivia, with a handshake that nearly cracked my knuckles. "No time to waste," she said, and led me straight past the sun-bleached barns and into a hidden lab gleaming with cutting-edge tech. On a platform in the center was a machine I'd only ever dreamed of seeing again, an engine. Impossibly advanced, an evolution of something I'd once designed and thought was lost forever. "They all say it's dead," Olivia said, voice quiet but certain. "But I want to hear your opinion. I lost myself in that lab for 2 days and nights, barely stopping to eat or rest." They handed me a stack of diagnostic printouts the thickness of a phone book, but I barely glanced at them. That was their mistake. They thought machines talked only in numbers, but sometimes you had to listen in other ways. I laid my hands on the metal, closed my eyes, and let the story come to me. I heard a tiny stutter in the injection cycle. A missed beep that the computers wrote off as noise. "It's not dead," I told Olivia, hoarse and wired after 40 straight hours. "It's out of tune." I sketched out a new calibration, rewrote their control logic in a caffeine-fueled burst, and waited, heart pounding, as they ran the patch. The machine came to life, the sound deepening from a tortured groan to a perfect, steady thrum. In that moment, I felt more alive than I had in years. Olivia sat across from me as I explained my thinking, her sharp gaze never wavering. For the first time, I saw understanding in someone's eyes, real understanding. When I finished, she nodded. "You're not just fixing machines, Camille. You're talking to them. That's rare, and that's why I need you." She slid a thick contract across the table. "I've read everything. I know what happened to the Prometheus prototype. I know about the explosion, and I know the official story isn't the truth." My heart thudded in my chest. "Your work deserves respect, not erasure. The Prometheus project is failing. I need you not as Colonel Vale's daughter, not as a scapegoat, but as the engineer who can save it." I don't remember standing up, but I was suddenly on my feet, tears streaming down my face, tears I hadn't let fall for years. Not for humiliation or pain, but for sheer, unfiltered relief. The kind that comes when a stranger sees you more clearly than your own family ever did. "Do you ever feel that?" I wanted to ask her. "Like your whole life, you were waiting for someone to see you, not as a story, but as yourself?" She didn't answer, but I saw something soften in her face, a flicker of kindness that was more valuable than any medal. When I returned to Iron Ridge under Dr. Bennett's authority, the news moved faster than the wind. My father couldn't defy the Pentagon, but he knew how to make his displeasure felt. The base chilled around me. People stopped meeting my eyes. He was a master at silent warfare, no open attack, just the slow, isolating squeeze of every little cold shoulder. The first technical briefing was brutal. I was supposed to be a consultant, but everyone in that room knew I was the original architect. I tried to explain the subtle frequency anomaly I'd found, but I'd barely begun before Ben Holloway, my father's favorite, cut me off with a smirk. "With all due respect, Miss Vale," he drawled, "that's a razor disguised as courtesy. Your intuition might work for farm equipment, but we operate on data. Hard numbers. The data doesn't agree with your hunch." The room was silent. No one looked at me. It was a show orchestrated to put me back in my box. I kept my voice steady. "You're not asking the right questions, Holloway. You're listening for what you want, not for what the engine is actually saying." That evening, in my sterile temporary quarters, my phone rang. Blocked number. My father. The voice that greeted me was calm, almost gentle, and somehow 100 times more dangerous. "Camille, I hear you're causing friction with Holloway's team. You're digging up old ghosts. You need to remember your place. You're here as a consultant, nothing more. Don't make trouble." I could hear the boundaries being drawn, the box being built around me again. My jaw clenched. "My place," I replied, ice in my tone, "is as the person who built this system from the ground up. And I know it was changed." A pause. When he spoke again, there was no silk, just cold steel. "I refined it. Your original design was reckless. I made it safer. Don't ruin this for everyone with your arrogance." He was rewriting history, making himself the hero, painting me as the dangerous child. I almost laughed, but I hung up. Instead, the phone rang again before I could breathe. This time, my mother, her voice thick with preemptive tears. "Camille, you're hurting your father. His career, our family name, it's all at risk. Please, for your brother's sake. Just stop. Don't destroy everything over your pride." Needles every word. She turned my pursuit of truth into selfishness, weaponized family honor to silence me as she always had. The realization came sharp and bitter. My father was the storm, but my mother was the air that let the mold grow. The enabler. Something inside me snapped. The family's honor was lost when nobody stood for the truth, I said, and even I was startled by how calm my voice was. She sputtered, but I ended the call, hands shaking not from fear but from a rage so clean it felt like light. That night, I knew I couldn't rely on memory or even intuition. I needed proof, cold, undeniable, bulletproof evidence. The real war was just beginning. Sleep was impossible. I sat at my secure laptop in the ghostly green glow of the screen, every old skill from technical intelligence coming back. I slipped quietly past the base's security, not like a battering ram, but like a shadow, a low-level admin checking on forgotten archives. I wasn't looking for top-secret files that would trigger alarms. I was hunting for what nobody bothered. Tied well, maintenance logs, calibration archives, the digital skeletons left by the careless and the arrogant. Hours ticked by, my heart pounding. I found it buried in a folder so obscure it might as well have been invisible. Temporary calibration reports, Q3. Inside, a log of the changes made to the Prometheus emergency alert system. My original 6-stage protocol gone, replaced with a crude 2-stage failsafe. And at the bottom, a signature. Colonel Richard Vale, alone, time-stamped. Just 24 hours before the explosion. It wasn't a mistake. It was sabotage, but the real blow came next. I kept digging, frantic, desperate. Then a scanned images schematic in my own handwriting, with a note in his, positioning altered per Holloway's recommendation for launch efficiency. RV, it was a lie. Holloway would never have made that change. It violated basic engineering. My father hadn't just sabotaged the design. He created a false trail, blaming his own protege. He'd built my coffin and signed another man's name on it. All the years of pain, the gaslighting, the humiliation became something cold and sharp. This wasn't just about a failed project. He'd been willing to ruin me for his own survival. My hands shook as I kept searching. In the public archive, a social bulletin, a cocktail party at the officers' club hosted by my father, celebrating the successful restructuring of the Prometheus project. Toasting to the future while I was left in ashes. I felt stripped. Bare, howling in silence. The old radio in the corner sputtered to life, and by some strange twist, a voice came through a broadcast of an old speech. It is not the critic who counts... The credit belongs to the one in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood... I listened, tears running down my cheeks, the words searing me clean. I stood. I copied every file, every log, every damning note onto an encrypted drive. It felt like a weapon in my hand, a blade forged in silence, ready for war. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. My eyes burned. "You chose the wrong arena, Colonel," I whispered, making my vow. "Now you'll have to face the warrior you created." Dawn broke over the mountains. I didn't feel tired, I felt reborn. The battle was only beginning. By the time the desert sun was burning overhead, I was locked in my temporary office, an anonymous little cell with walls so thin, I could hear every cough from the next room. On the desk in front of me, the encrypted flash drive, a battered laptop, and a growing stack of printed evidence. The data wasn't just digital anymore. It was real, hard, physical, undeniable. I arranged the logs, the altered schematics, the signature, every damning timestamp, not as a victim's desperate file dump, but as a prosecutor's arsenal. I didn't want justice handed down from above. I was going to engineer it from the ground up, piece by piece, the way I always had, with precision, logic, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows she's right. My hands didn't shake. My mind was laser sharp. I labeled, cross-referenced, built a timeline of deceit so tight no general could slip through it. It wasn't going to be an emotional plea. This would be a technical inquest, A trial by truth and engineering. By noon, the room was sweltering. The only interruption was a soft, almost apologetic knock. When I opened the door, there stood David Lynn, the youngest analyst from Holloway's team. I noticed him before, quiet, always scribbling in the margins of his notes, trying to blend into the wallpaper. Now he looked terrified. "Major Vale?" he whispered, voice cracking. He was the only one who still used my old rank, and for a moment that tiny sign of respect nearly broke me. I was the analyst who ran the original diagnostics. After the accident, before they wiped everything. I didn't say anything. I was scared. I kept a copy. I shouldn't have, but I did. "Please, take it. I can't sleep anymore." He held out a small, battered USB drive. I looked at his trembling hands, his haunted eyes, and I knew exactly what he was risking. His family, his future. The consequences of crossing a man like my father. "Thank you, David," I said quietly, taking the drive. "You did the right thing." He gave a jerky nod, eyes shining with a kind of shame and hope, and nearly sprinted out of the office. In my palm, that little drive felt like the missing piece to everything a before to match the after. The original unedited logs, the truth. But I knew data alone would never be enough. In the world my father built, power trumped. Facts and a folder of digital files could be hand-waved away as interpretation. I needed something more, a public demonstration that could not be spun or denied. I roamed the hallway until I found an empty briefing room, its whiteboard, untouched and gleaming under the harsh lights. My hands were steady as I uncapped a marker and began to draw, memory guiding every line. The elegant coolant loops, the pressure valve logic, the warning protocol that had been my signature. I drew and drew, not pausing, not trembling. When I finished, my entire original design for the Prometheus engine covered the board, as clean and precise as if I'd printed it. In the corner, with deliberate care, I wrote my name, Camille Evale. As I clicked the cap back on, a shadow fell over the board. Ben Holloway stood in the doorway, arms crossed, mouth curled in a sneer. "Still playing with your drawings, Vale? Cute, maybe you should go back to fixing tractors." This is the big leagues now. I didn't turn. I didn't acknowledge him at all. I kept drawing, adding a final note to the schematic, signing it a second time, larger and prouder. My work was no longer just a blueprint. It was a gauntlet. A public accusation written in the language that had always been denied me. The next morning, Dr. Bennett saw the board. She stopped, studied every line, then met my eyes. No words, just a subtle nod, a signal. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Emergency simulation review scheduled for this afternoon." No option to decline. My father moved fast. He reframed the review not as an investigation, but as a demonstration of project resilience. He invited a handful of influential defense journalists, hoping to turn my challenge into my execution, a performance where he and Holloway could humiliate me on the record, cement their version of the truth. When I entered the simulation chamber that afternoon, the air was electric. Holloway's engineers avoided my eyes. The journalists lined the back wall, cameras and pens poised, some looking bored, others hungry for a scandal. My father and Holloway stood together, radiating smug confidence. "Run the current configuration," my father ordered, voice booming with command. The lead engineer, pale and nervous, initiated the sequence. On the massive holoscreen, the 3D model of the Prometheus engine spun to life. For a few tense seconds, everything looked fine. Then warning lights began to blink. The numbers flashed red. The virtual engine's deep groan shifted to a tortured shriek. At 92 seconds, the simulation crashed in a wall of alarms. Critical. Failure, rotor imbalance, catastrophic event imminent. Holloway leapt into action, slamming the emergency stop. He turned to the press, face grave and competent. "As you can see, we're managing legacy instabilities from the original design. Our team is working overtime to mitigate risks." He was blaming me, cementing the lie. My father nodded, jaw set in righteous disappointment. They had spent years preparing for this moment, certain the script would never be challenged, but Dr. Bennett stepped forward. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." Now, she turned, cool and unyielding. "We will run the simulation with Major Vale's original parameters." My heart jolted at the use of my rank, my true rank. Holloway hesitated, forced to take the encrypted drive from my hand and plug it in. He leaned in, voice low enough only for me. Let's see your ghost dance. He thought he'd win. The simulation began again. The numbers leapt. Warnings flashed. The system, unfamiliar with its original settings, resisted fighting against the constraints that had been welded into it after my exile. The journalists whispered, exchanging cynical looks. Holloway shot me a look of smug satisfaction. This was the failure he wanted, the proof he built his reputation on, but I was ready. Pause simulation, I commanded, voice cutting through the noise. I stepped forward, entered the manual override. I recalibrated 3 variables, the fuel mix, the coolant rate, the feedback loop. I didn't need the screens. I listened, let the machine's rhythm settle in my mind. Continue, I said. The room held its breath. The alarms faded one by one. The lights, frantic and red, stilled to amber, then green. The hum of the engine in the simulation deepened no. Longer shrieking, but smooth, powerful, unbreakable. The clock ticked past 92 seconds. 120, 180, all the way to 300, not a single error, not a single alarm. The system ran at 7% higher efficiency than even I had hoped for. For a full minute, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of perfection. Then I saw the shifted journalists. Lowering cameras, faces pale with realization. They turned from the machine to Holloway and my father, and what they saw was not victory, but ruin. Holloway frozen, face slack. My father suddenly ashen, eyes hollow and wild. The Emperor stood naked in the arena dot. The silence was deafening. It was the end of an era. The moment truth outran power, the aftermath was savage. The defense reporters invited. To watch my fall wrote about the technical coup that upended decades of command. The story exploded across every channel. Within days, the Pentagon launched a formal inquiry. My father was suspended. Holloway was fired for gross incompetence and professional misconduct. The empire they had built, 40 years in the making, came crumbling down in a week. I thought I would feel triumph, some wild rush of justice. But all I felt was empty, washed out, as if a storm had blown through and left only silence behind. The war was over. The truth had won, but peace was a stranger. To me, I had no idea what would come next. The aftermath was a storm of headlines, investigation notices, and calls from Pentagon officials I'd never met. My face was suddenly everywhere. Whistleblower engineer exposes military sabotage. They used my name as a symbol, not a person, but the attention felt cold and clinical. I watched the empire my father built, one of fear and absolute control, splinter and tumble like glass. His legend, his legacy, dissolved under a harsh white spotlight, and still, I found no joy in it. 3 days after the simulation, my phone rang. It was my brother, Eric. For one reckless second, I let myself hope he was calling to check on me, maybe even to understand. But the moment I answered, his voice exploded with accusation and panic. What did you do? He yelled, raw panic slicing through his words. You destroyed him. You ruined Dad, ruined me. Do you realize what you've done to my future, to my connections? You did this, Camille. You did this for your own selfish ego. I listened to his tirade, letting every word land like a stone sinking into deep water. He was right about one thing. I had destroyed the illusion of our family. But he saw only the loss of comfort and status, not the original betrayal. Not the years I'd spent erased, my victories repackaged as his own. When his anger finally sputtered out and he paused, breathless, I answered him, my voice level and cold. You never once asked how I felt, Eric. Not 3 years ago, not now. Goodbye. I ended the call, blocked his number, and sat in silence. Last thread to that version of family was cut. And it didn't hurt. It just felt quiet. I thought the hardest part would be the exposure, the public humiliation, the trial. I was wrong. It was the emptiness that followed, the clean, echoing silence after years of noise and accusation. The press wanted interviews. My old colleagues sent emails, some congratulating, some cautious, some hoping to keep their distance, in case one crashed and burned. I didn't answer any of them. A few days later, the final confrontation came. I was under the Ford in my garage, grease blackening my hands, when a familiar sedan rolled up and stopped in a swirl of dust. My father stepped out. No uniform, no medals, just an old man in civilian clothes, moving slowly as if each step cost him something he no longer had to spare. He stood in the shade of the garage, eyes shadowed and sunken. For a moment, I saw him as he was, Not as the legend he crafted, small, fallible, tired. He started to speak, voice worn and rasping, trying to explain, to rationalize, the words falling over themselves in the dry air. I just wanted to protect you, Camille. Your design was too dangerous. I never thought it would go this far. The same story, the same self-serving excuse. I wiped my hands on a rag and raised my palm, a gesture that stopped him cold. For once, the authority was all mine. Don't, I said, soft but final. Don't insult my intelligence. You didn't do this to protect me. You did it for yourself, for your legacy, for control. He opened his mouth, closed it. He didn't argue because he knew I was right. There was nothing left. I reached into my pocket and twisted off the West Point ring he put on my finger at graduation, a symbol of everything he believed he'd passed down: command, tradition, and more than anything, the right to control the narrative. I stepped forward and dropped it into his open palm. It looked tiny and absurd, swallowed up by his trembling hand. I'm giving this back, I said, steady, clear, and free of anger or malice. I don't need your legacy. I'm going to build my own from the wreckage you left behind. My legacy will be the truth. I turned and walked back into my garage. The clang of the rolling door as it came down behind me was the full stop at the end of his story. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I had nothing to prove. No one left to beg for validation, and I was free. Freedom, I learned, isn't a sudden fireworks burst. It's quiet. It's empty at first, a vast, strange, echoing room that I had to learn how to fill. I spent the first weeks lost, pacing the silent garage, waiting for anger or joy or something to catch hold. But there was nothing except the hum of distant traffic, the tap of rain on the tin roof, the gentle creak of the building settling as the sun went down. For a while, I was haunted by memories of the battlefield, my father's voice booming, my mother's tears, the sick thrill of the machine coming alive in the simulation chamber. They faded slowly, replaced by the rhythms of ordinary life: coffee brewing, tools clinking, hands getting dirty fixing engines that belonged to neighbors. Not generals. As weeks turned to months, I realized I'd built something new. Bay 11 wasn't just a place for me anymore. I bought the adjacent bay, knocked down the wall, and expanded. My uncle's old toolbox, battered and scarred, became the symbol of the new life I was making. I named it the David Project after him. A tuition-free technical school for female veterans. Every morning, the garage filled with the clang of metal, the buzz of voices, the warmth of laughter. Instead of lonely silence, there was the symphony of women learning, building, failing, and fixing together. I didn't teach from textbooks. I taught them what my uncle had taught me: to listen, to trust their hands, to find the truth in the engine's rhythm, not in someone else's story. Late one afternoon, as the sun bled orange across the New Mexico sky, a thick envelope arrived, heavy with official seals. Inside was a handwritten letter from Dr. Bennett. The investigation was over. My rank of major had been fully reinstated with back pay, honors, and an offer to return and lead a new R&D division. The Navy needs people like you, Camille, she wrote. People who speak the truth to power. I smiled, folded the letter, and placed it in a wooden box with my uncle's old possessions. Validation was sweet, but it didn't define me anymore. The official chapter was closed. I was finally wholly mine. The garage doors were open to the cooling air. I sat on the stoop, watching my students finish up for the day. One, a young Marine named Harper, was struggling with a complex transmission, her shoulders hunched in. Frustration. I walked over, reached into my uncle's old toolbox, and pulled out a battered wrench, the handle worn smooth by years of use. My uncle used to say a good engineer doesn't force a machine, I said, voice soft and private. She persuades it. Listen to what it needs. I placed the wrench in Harper's hands, saw her eyes light up with understanding, and knew in that instant what my real legacy was. Not the Prometheus project. Not the ring or the name. It was this, a moment of knowledge passed on, a new chapter being written in oil and steel and hope. As the last of the students headed home and the sky deepened to purple, I sat quietly, breathing in the clean air, feeling the hush settle around. The emptiness wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace, but before I could fully embrace it, a new whisper crept in a memory, a hope, a tiny voice inside. Could I really move on? Had I finally silenced the ghosts, or were they simply waiting? For another night to come knocking? The weeks slipped by quietly, each day smoothing the edges of the old pain a little more. For the first time, I found myself waking not to a sense of dread, but to possibility. My mornings were simple, coffee and old radio humming in the corner. A garage bathed in sunlight and a calendar filled with the names of women who had survived their own wars. No more uniform, no more code words or locked doors. Just tools, sweat, and the slow, steady construction of something honest. Sometimes, late at night when the desert wind rattled the windows and I was the last one left, I'd let myself think about the past. Not out of longing, but as a kind of archaeological dig, brushing away the dirt to see what I could salvage. I no longer heard my father's roar in my dreams. It was just a memory now, one that faded a little more each time I shared a laugh with my students, or watched them coax life out of a battered transmission that someone else had given up on. But there were still moments that caught me off guard when the old ache would surface. Like the first time I saw my name in the mail again, Major Camille Vale, R&D Consultant, United States Navy. I'd been reinstated, as if those years of exile could be erased with a signature. The world tried to tell me that the truth had set me free, but freedom, I was learning, was more complicated than that. It was a blank canvas, waiting for me to decide what picture to paint. I never replied to Dr. Bennett's offer. I kept the letter, though, in the same wooden box as my uncle's. Compass and the old, faded schematic from my very first engine. Maybe someday I would answer, maybe not. The urge to prove myself was gone. What mattered now was the shape of my own days. One Saturday, just as the heat broke and a rare breeze swept through the garage, a stranger appeared at the bay doors. He was young, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and a scar just visible under his hairline. He introduced himself as Sam, a former Army mechanic. He'd heard about the David Project from a friend, and he wanted to learn anything, everything. Just not to be invisible anymore. I saw myself in him, raw, proud, desperate for belonging. I welcomed him inside. For hours, we talked engines and wiring diagrams and how to fix a hydraulic line with nothing but duct tape and hope. He told me about nights he couldn't sleep, about the heavy silence he carried since returning home. You know, he said, sometimes the quiet's the hardest part. I nodded. Sometimes it is. But it's where you hear yourself if you listen close enough. That night, after everyone left, I lingered by the open bay doors. The desert sky was a cathedral of stars, impossibly wide. I thought about the women and men whose lives now intersected with mine. The new stories weaving through Bay 11 and Bay 12. Each one a quiet defiance against the idea that we had to stay broken forever. For the first time in years, I felt something close to gratitude, not for what I'd lost, but for the chance to build something lasting from the ruins. One afternoon, as the sun slid low, my mother called. I hesitated, phone heavy in my hand, but I answered. Her voice was older, frailer, the drama gone. She asked about the school. She didn't mention my father or the investigation or the scandal that had fractured our family. Instead, she listened as I told her about my students, about Harper's first successful rebuild, about Sam's quiet determination, about the laughter that now filled a space that had once been all sharp corners and grief. When I finished, there was a long silence. For a moment, I thought she'd hung up. Then I heard her take a shaky breath. I'm proud of you, Camille, she said. Not for what you did to him, for what you made of yourself. For the first time, her words felt real small but solid, a pebble tossed into the vast quiet that surrounded me. I realized, with a strange mix of relief and sorrow, that forgiveness was possible, even if forgetting would never be. The year turned. Garage 11 and 12 became a living thing, a place where women who'd been underestimated, sidelined, or outright ignored could come and discover what they were capable of. We celebrated victories, mourned failures, and learned together. The work was hard, the hours long, but the satisfaction was real. I watched as the students found their voices, one by one, and with each new story, the power my father once held over my mind faded just a little more, and yet every so often, a shadow would pass, a memory of the old empire, a pang of regret for what could never be reclaimed. Some nights I'd find myself tracing the faint groove on my finger where the West Point ring had once sat, remembering the girl who'd stood on a stage, invisible, clutching a trophy that wasn't really hers, but even then the ache was softer. It was just a ghost, and I was learning to live alongside it, to honor its lessons without letting it write the ending of my story. There was one final test. I knew I had to face a question I carried into every sunrise. Had I truly let go? Or was I just hiding in a different kind of silence? The answer, I realized, wouldn't come from a headline, a court ruling, or the forgiveness of a family that had never really seen me. It would come from the life I chose, from the hands I helped, from the engines I taught to sing again. And as I stood in the fading light, the voices of my students echoing across the empty bays, I knew this much. Whatever came next, I was finally ready to claim it. Spring arrived quietly in the desert, all at once and not at all, just a shift in the air. A few wildflowers brave enough to bloom along the road to the garage. It was during this season that the David Project began to truly come alive. Every week brought new faces, new stories, new challenges that no amount of military discipline or technical training could have prepared me for. We have veterans from all walks: combat medics, avionics specialists, intelligence officers, a pair of Navy welders with matching tattoos. Each one carried her own invisible cargo: grief, pride, exhaustion, and the stubborn will to survive. In the early days, I kept my distance, more teacher than peer. Old habits die hard. I watched for signs of weakness, failures, that familiar look of someone about to quit. But what surprised me was how often it was laughter rough, real, unguarded that broke the tension, not some hard-earned lesson or rousing speech. I taught what I knew, but it was in the sharing of their stories that the real repairs happened. One evening, as I walked the rows between workbench shoes, I found Harper, the same young Marine who'd struggled with the transmission, working late. Hands buried in an old V8 block. Her hair was tied back with a dirty red bandana, face streaked with grease, jaw set in fierce concentration. I pulled up a stool and watched in silence as she cussed softly under her breath, then suddenly grinned as the stubborn part finally came loose. "Thought you might go home tonight," I teased, careful to keep the tone light. Harper looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes. "Didn't want to let it win," she said. "I figure if I can fix this, maybe I can fix a few other things." I recognized that look, the hunger for small victories, the hope that fixing a machine might somehow fix the parts of yourself that feel broken. "Sometimes you start with what you can control," I said, remembering my own late nights with a pile of scrap, willing something dead to wake up and give you back a sense of power. "The rest follows." She nodded, not looking at me, and I understood. The lesson didn't need to be spoken out loud. That spring we started a tradition. Every Friday, after the last wrench was put down and the tools cleaned, we'd gather in the lot behind the garage's paper plates balanced on knees. Borrowed speakers playing everything from Fleetwood Mac to Lizzo, voices rising together in laughter and argument and the occasional off-key song. Some weeks I'd cook. Other times, students brought dishes that reminded them of home chili rollinos, Texas brisket, rice and beans, fried catfish. Those nights, the air filled with stories and the kind of loud, unrestrained joy that had once felt impossible to me. It was there, under the string lights and desert stars, that I saw how much we'd all changed. There were new calluses on everyone's hands, yes, but also new ease in their laughter, a gentleness in their strength. And in those moments, I realized my uncle's quiet wisdom had become our shared language. The machine only obeys the truth. Still, I found myself grappling with doubt some nights. Was I really building something lasting, or just hiding from a world that would always be waiting with another test? I saw the headlines about the investigation, the articles with my name still attached. Some painted me a hero, others a troublemaker. None of them knew me. One day, a letter arrived addressed to Major Camille Vale, care of the David Project. Inside was a note from a woman named Jasmine, a young engineer who had served under Holloway and left after the scandal. She wrote about how she'd been told again and again that she was too intuitive, not systematic enough, that she should stick to the process and leave the creativity to the real engineers. She told me that watching the simulation play out, watching me stand firm, had changed her mind about quitting the field. "You made space for someone like me," she wrote, her handwriting fierce and looping, "and now I'm making space for the next woman, too." I read the letter twice, handshaking, then tucked it with Dr. Bennett's offer in my old wooden box. That small, private archive was heavier than any metal. On the anniversary of the day, my world split apart. I took the whole crew on a field trip to an abandoned farm on the outskirts of town where the oldest generator in the county sat in a collapsed barn. It was a challenge, a joke, a lesson. We spent the whole afternoon tearing down rusted panels, hunting for the problem. The machine was stubborn, but so were we. Late in the day, with the sky pink and the air full of dust, Harper found the broken circuit. The old beast roared back to life, rattling the rafters, and we all cheered as if we'd landed on the moon. Driving home in the golden hour, I realized I hadn't thought of my father once that day, not as a critic, not as a ghost. I'd spent a year walking through the fire, and somehow I'd come out not burned, but transformed. The real test wasn't winning or losing in some grand arena. It was living your truth quietly, stubbornly, day after day, with whatever tools you had left. But even as I let that lesson settle, I knew life has a way of throwing new challenges just when you think you've reached the end of the road. And somewhere deep inside, I wondered, would I ever stop waiting for the other shoe to drop? Or was that just the price of survival for someone who'd learned to listen to engines and to silence and to the voices that mattered most? The sun dipped low as I pulled back into Bay 11, the old familiar ache of longing finally replaced by something softer anticipation, maybe, or just the ordinary, everyday hope that tomorrow would be enough. Summer arrived in a wave of heat and sudden thunderstorms. The David Project was growing 3 new students every month, a waiting list longer than I'd dreamed possible. Word spread that Bay 11 was where women found their confidence again. I kept busy, too busy, sometimes afraid that if I paused, the silence would swallow me up and I'd fall back into the old pattern of waiting for disaster. But the truth was, life had become ordinary in the most beautiful way. I woke early, made coffee, swept the garage, listened to the hum of early morning voices rising from the workbenches. We fixed engines. We fixed ourselves. I thought I finally found my rhythm, but healing is never a straight line. I learned that the hard way when the past, which I thought I'd buried, showed up in the form of a Defense Department delegation. There was no warning a convoy of government cars parked outside one Tuesday morning, a uniformed officer at the door with a stern expression and a file in his hands. His name was Colonel Watkins, and he brought a message from the Pentagon, an official commendation, another offer to head up a new experimental division, and a veiled request that I consult on an urgent project with national security implications. As he spoke, the faces of my students peered out from behind workbenches, their conversations stilled by the sight of uniforms. I felt old instincts wake in my chest: discipline, suspicion, the weight of duty. Watkins talked about the need for visionary leaders and engineering courage. He described a new initiative, one that would benefit from my unique perspective. I could have said yes. I could have taken the promotion, the high security clearance, the recognition that had been stolen from me years before. I saw in his eyes that he expected me to. But I looked around at my students, at the battered toolbox on my desk, at the old photos of my uncle, and I realized the choice was already made. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, I said, my voice firm and gentle, but I'm exactly where I need to be. My work is here. He hesitated, clearly surprised. You're passing up a chance to make history, Major Vale. I already am, I replied, right here. When the delegation left, the relief was palpable. Laughter bubbled up in the garage, louder than before, and someone plugged in the radio and started a playlist. Harper sidled up to me, grinning. I would have said yes if it meant less paperwork, I smiled. They don't teach you how to fix a crankshaft in a Pentagon office. That night, I sat on the stoop with a mug of coffee and watched the stars wheel over the dark horizon. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd left behind: soldier, scapegoat, engineer, outcast. I thought about the pain of being erased, the white-hot anger that had once driven me. I wondered if I'd made the right choice, or if deep down I was still afraid to risk everything again. A sudden summer storm rolled in, rattling the windows, shaking the old tin roof. I listened to the thunder, felt the tension gather in my chest. There was a message waiting for me on my phone, a short, sharp line from Eric, my brother. He's sick. He's asking for you. I stared at the words, numb. For a long time. I let the message sit, unsure if the ache I felt was guilt, dread, or simply exhaustion. My father, the man who had nearly destroyed me, was calling me home. The question I'd carried for months: had I really moved on, or just found a new hiding place, suddenly took on new weight. I slept poorly, haunted by memories of the past, torn between the urge to stay safe in the world I'd built and the sense of unfinished business. In the morning, I looked in the mirror and saw not the broken woman I'd been, but someone forged by pain, tempered by truth, and ready at last to face whatever came next. With trembling hands, I packed a small bag. Harper noticed, concern etched on her face. "You okay, Camille?" I nodded, forcing a small smile. "I have to take care of something, hold the fort while I'm gone." She grinned, giving me a mock salute. "We'll be fine." "Go show them what you're made of." As I drove away, the road stretching before me like a line into the unknown, I felt a strange mix of dread and hope. The silence was different now, not a prison, but a pause before the next note. I had survived the fire, built a new life from ashes, and found my own symphony in the chorus of voices at Bay 11. But now, I was heading back into the past toward a reckoning I could no longer avoid. Would I finally find closure, or would the ghosts of what came before demand more than I was willing to give? The drive back to the city felt endless, a highway ribboning through pale morning light, my thoughts churning with every mile. I rehearsed conversations I might never have, bargaining with ghosts and half-memories. At each familiar turn, the tension wound tighter. When I finally pulled up in front of my parents' modest house, I sat for a long time with the engine running, the hum beneath my hands both comfort and warning. Inside, the air was heavy with silence, broken only by the steady tick of a clock and the muted sound of a nurse bustling in the kitchen. My mother greeted me, her face drawn, her eyes ringed with worry. There was no lecture, no accusation this time, just quiet relief that I'd come at all. "He's in his room," she said. He's not the man you remember." I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and walked down the hall I'd stormed out of years ago. The room was dim, curtains half drawn, the air tinged with antiseptic and the faint scent of old aftershave. My father, Colonel Richard Vale, once a force of nature, now reduced by illness, lay propped up on pillows, frail and shrunken. His hands, once so sure, trembled slightly on the blanket. He turned his head and squinted. For a moment, the old steel flickered in his gaze, but it faded quickly, replaced by something that looked like shame. "You came," he rasped, voice brittle as paper. I sat in the chair by his bedside. "I did." Silence settled between us, thick and complicated. I waited for blame, for excuses, for the old rehearsed story. But he only closed his eyes, took a breath that rattled, and let it out in a long sigh. "They say I ruined everything." He whispered, "Maybe they're right." It was a strange, lonely thing watching the architect of so much pain admit his own defeat. I thought I would feel triumph, vindication, maybe even pity. But what I felt was something quieter, sadder. The end of a long, pointless war. "I didn't come for an apology," I said, my voice steady. "And I don't need your forgiveness. I came because you asked." He nodded, tears brimming in his faded eyes. "I never understood you. I tried to shape you in my image, and when you didn't fit, I broke you instead." He looked away. "You deserved better." I swallowed hard, the anger and grief and longing all tangled in my chest. "You could have chosen differently." "So could I." A fragile silence hung between us, a peace forged from mutual exhaustion rather than understanding. "I'm proud of you," he said at last, his voice so soft I almost missed it. "Not for what you did to me, but for surviving it. For finding your own way. It wasn't everything I wanted. It wasn't nearly enough to erase the scars. But it was the first true thing he'd ever said to me, and I held it close. We sat together for a long time, listening to the hum of the old house and the life going on outside, a dog barking, children's laughter, a car passing down the street. Eventually, he drifted into sleep. I stood, pressed my palm gently to his, and turned to go dot in the hallway. My mother waited. Her eyes were red, but she managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I stepped out into the sunlight, the weight on my chest finally began to lift. I didn't know what would come next from my family, if there would be healing, or only the quiet acceptance of all that had been lost. But I knew that I'd done what I needed to do, not for them, but for me. The drive home was different. The road seemed shorter, the sky wider, the horizon open. When I pulled up to Bay 11, the familiar clang and laughter spilled out into the evening air. My students greeted me with cheers and questions and hugs. It was the kind of welcome I never got as a child, the kind I'd spent my whole life chasing. That night, as the last rays of sun slipped away and the garage filled with the music of new stories, I finally understood. Closure isn't a finish line or a single moment. It's a decision to quiet, stubborn choice to lay down the burden of old pain and build something better from its remains. I still had work to do. We all did. But for the first time, the future felt like something I could choose, not something I had to survive. And as the stars blinked to life over the desert, I whispered a simple promise to myself, a vow stronger than any oath I'd sworn in uniform. Whatever comes next, I will not hide. I will not let anyone else write my story. My silence is over. My legacy is mine. I settled back into the rhythm of the workshop with a feeling I'd never had before, a kind of lightness, as if a storm had finally passed. The garage was no longer just a refuge or a battlefield. It was my world, built on the ashes of an old life, alive with the sounds of laughter, tools clanging, and the steady thrum of new purpose. News of my visit home traveled quickly among the women. Harper approached me as I was cleaning carburetors, her eyes soft with worry. How did it go? I thought about how to answer. It wasn't what I wanted, I said honestly. But it was what I needed. She nodded, understanding in the way only someone who's fought her own private wars could. Sometimes just showing up is the bravest thing. Word kept spreading about Bay 11, a small article in the local paper. A few social media posts, suddenly more women were knocking at the door. Single mothers, retirees, even a grandmother in her 70s who wanted to rebuild her late husband's old truck. I saw something shift in them as they worked, shoulders relaxing, voices growing bolder, a sense of belonging seeping in where there had once been only isolation. One afternoon, as the summer lights streamed through the windows, I called a meeting of everyone in the shop. The room filled with students, some greasy, some tired, all curious. I stood before them, nerves fluttering but resolve steady. I told them about the day I first walked through fire, about the betrayal, the exile, the war inside my own family. I told them how I'd learned to listen to engines and to silence, to trust my hands when nothing else seemed certain. You don't have to be perfect, I said. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to show up for yourself, even when no one else does. That's what brought me here. That's what will carry you too. There was a hush, then a round of applause, not wild or loud, but warm, genuine. The kind that says, you're not alone. In their eyes, I saw my own journey reflected back at me, clearer and kinder than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. Shop became more than a classroom. It became a sanctuary, a place where we celebrated each small victory. An engine started, a wiring harness untangled, a first successful weld. Every challenge, every stubborn bolt or stripped screw was met together. Harper led the first women's car rally, a convoy of mismatched pickups and muscle cars rumbling down Main Street, each one patched up by a pair of determined hands. The parade made the local news. Children waved from the sidewalks. For a few shining hours, it felt like the whole town belonged to us. In quiet moments, I still caught myself reaching for the ring that was no longer on my finger, or wondering if my father would ever call again. But the grief didn't sting like it used to. It was a scar, not a wound. Something to remember, not something to fix. Sometimes, at dusk, I'd sit on the stoop and watch the sun burn down behind the distant mountains. The wind carried voices and laughter from inside the garage, and I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of oil and coffee and hope. I understood, finally, what my uncle meant all those years ago. Stories can be changed, but the machine only obeys the truth. I had changed my story not by rewriting the past, but by building a new future on my own terms. As the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, new students kept coming. Each woman brought a new story, a new challenge, a new spark to add to the growing fire at Bay 11. I watched as they lifted each other up, forging bonds that would outlast any engine or workshop. There were no more headlines. The world had moved on. But inside the shop, we were making our own news every day, quiet, uncelebrated, but utterly real. Sometimes the hardest battles end not with a victory, but with a gentle peace. I was learning to trust that peace, to rest in it, to let it soften the sharp edges I'd carried for so long. And as another year threatened to turn, I felt the question rise up again, not as fear, but as invitation. What could we build next if we truly believed we deserved it? The first cold wind of autumn swept through the garage doors, stirring sawdust and the last of summer's heat. In the years since the firestorm that upended my world, Bay 11 and Bay 12 had become more than workshops. They were living, breathing Proof that scars didn't have to be hidden, they could be transformed into blueprints for something stronger. That fall, the David Project reached its 5th class of graduates. On the morning of the ceremony, the sun painted the bay doors gold, and I stood before a row of women who had once believed they had nothing left to offer. Harper wore her coveralls like a badge of honor, beaming as she handed out certificates. Old friends and new faces filled the room, families huddling together, camera flashes bright in the soft garage light. I gave a short speech, hands tucked into my back pockets to hide their trembling. I spoke about stubbornness and second chances, about how the world will always find new ways to test you, but the only legacy worth having is the one you build for yourself. There were tears, laughter, and above all, pride so deep I could hardly speak. After the ceremony, I found myself alone at the workbench, tracing the lines of my first engine schematic, now framed and mounted above the tool racks. My uncle's old wrench sat beside it, battered and worn from years of use. For a long while, I just listened to the sound of the garage alive with voices, students teaching each other, stories traded over coffee, the whir of power tools and the tap-tap of a stubborn bolt finally giving way. The quiet was not empty anymore. It was full of life. I felt the presence of everyone who'd shaped my journey, my uncle's quiet wisdom, my mother's cautious hope, my father's impossible standards, and finally his admission of regret. I missed him, sometimes in a way that no longer hurt. Even Eric, my brother, had called not long ago, his voice softer, bruised but trying. We didn't say much, just enough to know that some bridges, if not rebuilt, could at least stand unburned. A few weeks later, a letter arrived, another new name, another woman seeking a place to belong. I read her words, saw her doubts and her need, and I knew exactly how she felt. The old ache was gone, replaced by something steadier, purpose, not pain. One evening, as the desert sky faded from gold to bruised violet, I gathered the latest class of students around the fire pit out back. We roasted marshmallows, passed around mugs of cider, and told the stories that never made the news, of small failures and quiet victories, of the strength found in persistence and the grace in starting over. Someone asked, "How did you learn to trust yourself again?" I thought for a moment, letting the sparks drift up into the night. I stopped asking permission. I stopped waiting for the world or my family to tell me who I was. I listened for the truth, even when it was hard, especially then. And I built my life around that, one piece at a time. Later, when the fire died down and the laughter faded, I lingered outside, breathing the cool air, looking up at a sky I'd once thought belonged only to other people. The fear was still there sometimes, but it was smaller, easier to carry. The silence I'd once dreaded had become a space for hope, for building, for dreaming. If you're reading or listening to this, know that your story isn't finished, not while you still have breath in your body and hands to shape the world around you. There will always be critics and old ghosts and days when it feels impossible to move forward. But you have your own engine to build, your own legacy to claim. The world doesn't get to decide your worth, only you do. So take a breath. Pick up your tools. Trust the truth only you can hear and build something that outlasts every storm. And if this story meant something to you, if you've walked through your own fire or found yourself standing alone in a silence you didn't choose, I hope you'll share your strength in the comments below. Subscribe to Chosen Revenge, because every voice, especially yours, deserves to be heard. This is how my story continues, not in the shadow of what I lost, but in the light of what I've chosen to become.